Welcome back to the channel, my faithful few. Welcome back to the channel, guys. I'm glad you're here with me again today. In today's video, we're going to talk about dynamic range and getting good exposure. All right, so if you happen to be new here, I'm glad to have you. Thank you for visiting us. I want you to be part of the community. Now, if you happen to be new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me. Drop your name in a comment. I want to go follow you too. And I want to bring you some added value to you and your content creation. Now, one of the trickiest situations you could possibly run into is how to capture good exposure in daylight or bright situations. There's a couple of different things that we can do. I'm gonna give you one nugget real quick that's gonna really help your game when it comes to being able to get good exposure in daylight situations. When you go out, hold your hand up. Whichever side the sun hits, like whichever side is the bright side, you wanna shoot to the opposite of that. Basically, what I'm saying is you want to backlight your subject all day long. You can make sure that you're not going to get harsh light, okay? Because the light will be hitting the subject on the back side. You're coming around the front. If you can get it right behind the head, you'll be good to go, because the ambient light is bouncing around all over everything around you, including the ground, the trees, the sky, clouds, buildings, whatever. That's going to give you enough to be able to light your subject up. If not, reflectors. 5-in-1 reflector. I'll drop one in my description. You can go check it out. Now, the other thing that you can do is go ahead and set your exposure the same way that you normally would. ND filters. I'm shooting with the ND filter on right now just because out this window, sun's coming in pretty bright, but it's actually in the middle of the day. So, ND filters, it's like having sunshades on your camera. Now, a variable ND will allow you to adjust the brightness and darkness of that ND filter. So you can really kind of crank that intensity up. So let's say you've got a depth of field that you really like, but it's so bright outside that to have your aperture open that wide, it's making your image be overexposed. Well, you can use that variable ND to dial it in so that you can be able to get that actual exposure that you want. We would just start cranking up the shutter speed. Then when you do that, you run into the whole deal of this is video, it's not photo. And I want to make sure my motion blur stay natural looking. I don't want it to look robotic. I don't want it to look like a 4K movie with, high frame rates. I want it to have that natural look. And so the ND filters will really come in handy. I always use ND filters. A lot of times I use ND filters on my inside shots as well. I think that one of the things I want to do is I want to talk to you a little bit about dynamic range real quick. That's going to help us to really segue over into getting good exposure. Now, dynamic range, that basically is your ability to see in both the darkness and the light. All right, so if you look at, let's say, a wall or even the ground, anything where there's a shadow present, if you can see the information, and when I say information or when I say detail, I'm talking about whatever it is that you actually can see, even in the shadows. But that's part of your dynamic range. So when you look in the sky, when you look at the clouds, when you look in the sky and it's on a bright day and you can still see the clouds, that's also part of your dynamic range. Now, if you take one of these regular cameras and you aim it at the sky, depending on depending on how shallow your depth of field is, and also where your shutter speed is, and your ISO is going to determine just how much that sky is actually exposed. So when you look at it, if it looks like it's going to be white, that means that it's clipping. If you can see detail, and when I say detail, I really mean if you can see that actual sky, the clouds, the sun, the moon, whatever is up there, if you can see it and it's not clipped out, then that's part of your dynamic range. Okay, the same thing for shadows. When you look at the ground, if you can see the sand, the rocks, the concrete, the grass, anything under that actual shadow, if that shadow is just kind of overlaying it, that becomes your dynamic range. The cameras work in the same way, because I can guarantee you that when you look at that ground and you look at that blade of grass that's coming through the shadows with your natural eye, if you point a camera down to it, you may have to make some adjustments. See, the camera has a dynamic range and you have a dynamic range. And of course, most of the time, the more expensive the camera, the more dynamic range you're gonna have. So you've got some, I believe dynamic range will go up to 18, possibly 21. And a lot of these cameras only hit 8 or 9. So when you aim your camera somewhere, if you put your camera outside and you're looking in the sky and your sky is white on your video, but you can clearly see with your normal eye that there are clouds that you can visibly see, that means you need to be able to make an exposure correction. If you're looking at the grass and the shadows are not pitch black, that means you're going to have to make an adjustment to your exposure. So when you aim your camera outside and you're looking in the clouds, if you can see the clouds and the blue sky when you look on your camera, so when you have your camera and when you point it outside, the detail or the information that everyone talks about, that's going to be the things you can see in your highlights, okay, which would be the clouds, birds, animals, sun, anything that's actually in the sky. If that sky is not pure white to your eyes, then it shouldn't be pure white on your camera. If you look in the grass and you can see the actual grass underneath the shade or the shadows, then that lets you know that there's information there. So you have to be able to make the adjustments to your exposure to be able to expose those things properly. A properly exposed image will allow you to be able to see what's beneath the shadows and also what's contained in your highlights. That would be a properly exposed image. When it comes to dynamic range, all cameras are not made equal. That's just it. So then you have to begin to add additional tools. On a bright sunny day, you can use ND filters that will help you to be able to still maintain the brightness and also the depth of field that you would like to get, which we know would require you to open your aperture a lot so that you can get that blurry depth of field. But if it's in the middle of the day, you won't be able to get that. So an ND filter, those sunshades that I told you about, a variable ND will allow you to make the adjustment. And when you're making the adjustment, now you can begin to see, there is information in the highlights, there is information in the shadows. And by the way, when you're a beginner and you begin to hear things like, hey, there's data in the shadows, or there's data in the highlights, or there's detail in the highlights, or detail in the shadows, let me tell you what that is. That's whatever actually exists. So data, detail, those are exactly what it is that you're filming. So if the camera's on me, but you can't see my nose because it's not exposed properly, or the shadows are hitting it so hard that you can't see the crease in my nose, but you can make out I have a nose where you've just lost some of the detail or some of the information. So don't let that simple definition confuse you. Now, some of the tools that will help you to be able to control your exposure. Okay, I've already talked about ND filters. They're basically like sunshades for your camera lens. I've also talked about understanding dynamic range, which is how much information or how much of your image that you can actually see in the highlights of it and also in the shadows of your image. Now, some of the other tools, I'm going to go with my favorite one first. My favorite exposure tool is the histogram. You know, people look at the histogram and they think, man, that thing is massive, man, that thing is complex. And it is actually probably one of the easiest, in my opinion, one of the easiest ways to guarantee that you can get proper exposure. All right, I'm gonna give you the basic rules to it. You've got your right side of the histogram and you've got your left side of the histogram. Now, and you also have the middle. The right side of the histogram represents the highlights. There's a wall. Don't go past it. Don't let your graph go past it. That's it. The left side of the histogram represents the shadows. Don't let the graph information go past the left wall. The middle, those represents your midtones. As long as your graph does not go hit that wall on the right side or the left side, that means that you will be, or your initial image will fall within the zones of being properly exposed. It's really that simple. So when you get there, you're in the field, you've got your histogram overlay on your camera viewfinder, you make some adjustments to your ISO, that graph is going to move one way or the other. If you make some adjustments to your shutter speed, that graph is going to move one way or the other. If you make adjustments to your aperture, that graph is going to move one way or the other. Now, if you're a good editor, if you're a decent editor, or if you just want to be able to have the ability to edit once you get back to the studio, just make sure that you're not hitting the wall on either side. Now, when you have a balanced light meter on your camera and you're looking at that image, the more room that you have from that right side wall, the more room you'll have to play with in post with your highlights. Same thing for the left. The more room you have with the data that's approaching the left wall, the more room you'll have in post to make adjustments to your shadows. That's the histogram, just like that. What did that take, about 90 seconds? But that's basically it, you know. And your midtones, I mean, that's going to let you know how well your actual image, your actual subject is being exposed. So as like I said, the histogram, to me, that's one of my favorite. My second favorite, I'm gonna say the Waveform Meter, but that's more of a post-edit thing that I like to use, would be the Waveform. There are some video monitors or video recorders that actually have waveform meters that you can use to overlay your video display. Kind of same deal, you know. You go from 0 to 100, and as the graph begins to approach the 0 line, that's where you're in your shadow zone. Okay, so if it hits that shadow zone and starts to flatten out, that means you're clipping. That means you will be losing information or detail that is contained in the shadows. As it hits up here at 100, you'll begin to lose information that is in your highlights. There's also what the Ansel Adams zone system that you can also be able to look at, so that way you can be able to look and see where your images need to fall within the zone charts from 0 to 10. That way, that can also help you to properly expose your image. The next tool that I like, it's going to be a false color. I like the false color. That's another one of those that, because it's got so much information and all that stuff on there, people begin to get a little intimidated with. But the false color is actually, it's a beast. When you know what your subject is going to be, you can make sure that if you can fit that subject right around the gray/green area, you can know that you're properly exposing that actual subject. On most standard false color meters, anything in the purple or the pink is going to be when you begin to approach underexposed or clipping. Okay, on the upper end, anything that is in the yellow and red, it's like one level you're beginning to approach clipping in the highlights. The next level, you're clipping in the highlights. So again, you know, these different meters, they are here for you. My best advice on that is going to be this: get in there, find something that's either underexposed or overexposed, turn on the exposure meters, start making adjustments to your camera. That's it. I mean, it's, again, just like I said in the last video, can't break it. It's not like you're going to be overexposed so much one day your camera's just going to bottom out. Go into some situations where they are challenging. That's the only way you're going to grow in this thing, okay? That's the only way. Go out on a hot day. Go out there in the sun. I guarantee you, if you go out there on a hot day, in the middle of the day, even if you don't have an ND filter, well, I gave you the very first tool already. You go out in the middle of the day, you start shooting, you look at your camera and everything is white. Turn around because the sun is going to shine that one way. When you turn around, the sun will be at your back, bam. Now everything comes into full view. You can begin to make adjustments at that point. If you need to shallow out that aperture, if you need to bottom out that ISO, you will be able to expose. Now, in terms of shadowing and in terms of hard lines, that will be something that you have to deal with just because of the direction that you're shooting in and how the sun is. Now, but if you put that ND filter on, you can shoot wide open and you won't have to worry about it because you'll have that ND. You can almost blacken it out. We'll cover some low light exposure techniques, but I think just for the sake of time, because you could really get yourself into some creative juices when it comes to exposing at night. I think for me, I really kind of cut my chops on exposing at night so much to the point of almost, you know, not only was it a preference to expose in low light situations, but it took me probably a little bit longer to learn how to properly expose during the daytime because I did so many shoots that happened to be at night. So now when it comes to shooting at night, you know, the biggest thing is this: you're going to have to be able to get light into the camera. The more light that hits the sensor, the more information, data, or image that you'll actually be able to expose. Open that aperture up, set that shutter speed to twice the frame rate, lock that in place, okay? If it's video, lock it in place. Now, when it comes to the ISO, you have to crank that ISO up. And so this is where when you begin to look at some of those things like what we talked about in the video of how to choose the right camera. If you're going to be somebody that shoots primarily low light situations, you want to make sure you have a camera that is good in low light. I think on one of my first cameras, I believe that the ISO only went up to, I think, 12,800. And you know, depending on what the situation is, that just may not be enough for you to be able to properly get exposed, even at night. Just really kind of depends. So being able to expose at night, you need to be able to open your aperture up, because that's going to allow you some good optical contrast, as well as allow you to get maximum light in through the aperture. But also you being able to pull light from a source where you can let your ISO kind of take over, and you be able to be in control of that. That's going to help you with your low light exposure. One of the main goals with being able to shoot in low light, because you do have to add so much light into your camera sensor that is not natural light, is being able to find that fine balance, because this is what's going to either enhance or destroy your image quality. So these are the tools of exposure. You know, like I said, I really wanted to talk with you about exposure without overcomplicating it, because as a beginner, you know, we typically will watch videos, we'll see different tips and tricks and the different classes and all of those things, but at the end of the day, what it's going to come down to is you actually picking up that camera and working. Get those reps in. Keep getting those reps in. Don't find a situation that is challenging for you and decide you're going to let that situation stop you in your progress. Attack that situation. You know, get online and search for how people have figured out how to do those things. And once you figured out how to do whatever it is you need to do to overcome that situation, multiply it, create it, recreate that situation. Continue to just attack it. That's the only way to be able to dominate this camera. Well, that's a wrap, guys. I mean, like I said, I just wanted to come in here and quickly touch bases on exposure. I'm going to have some more in-depth videos about that, but my main purpose for these videos is being able to be a resource for people who are gonna go through this journey the way that I did, which is being self-taught. And so, you know, it's been a few years now for me. A lot of these things that I had questions over, I'm hoping to be able to answer those questions, kind of shortcut you through the process. So now, we've talked about exposure. We've talked about what it means. You know, you don't have to have an underexposed image. You don't have to have an overexposed image. You can have a $1,000 camera, or you can have a $30,000 camera. You can achieve the same kind of exposure. You may have to have some help with your $1,000 camera, but I guarantee you it's possible. So look, thank you for being here in this beginner series. I promise you that I've got more. And right now, if you could, share this video. I mean, it's, you know, the channel has begun to grow. I'm tripping, because I'm like, man, this is just something I wanted to do as a way to document my own process, you know, but now I'm finding more possibilities. So if this video has brought some added value to you and your content creation, please consider subscribing. Drop me a comment. I would love to hear what you think. If there's something specifically that you want me to cover, some question that you have, drop it in the comment. You know, I promise I will reply, and I'll do my absolute best just to answer your question. So take care, guys. We'll see you on the next video.